Story 1. The sound of footsteps on the roof. I live alone in a single-story house at the edge of the suburbs. The kind built fast in a good year and remembered for its thin wooden ceilings in a bad storm. Tonight, the storm chose me. Rain spread across the roof in steady sheets, and the wind pressed the walls like a slow, heavy breath. I sat on the couch with the TV on low. Not because I needed volume, but because a moving picture feels like company when the rest of the street goes dark. Then, between two lines of dialogue, I heard it, a footstep on the roof. Not the scatter of rain, not the ping of expanding metal, but a slow, deliberate compression, as if weight tested a plank and moved on. At first, I did the rational thing and supplied a rational cause. A neighborhood cat, perhaps, or a squirrel brave enough to treat a storm as cover. Animals cross roofs, people do not. Because that premise calmed me, I accepted my times 0.195s. However, the sound returned and, this time, carried shape. It approached from above the kitchen, traversed the seam where the dining room joins the living room, and paused directly overhead. A second step followed. The thin ceiling, paint over boards, boards over joists, transmitted the pressure cleanly. The TV, now too loud, became interference, so I muted it and listened. The rain offered a neutral background. The wind, a periodic swell, but the roof supplied a pattern. Step, wait, wood complaint, stillness. If I were hearing an animal, I told myself, I would hear skitter, not stride. If wind, then random knocks, not a measured approach. Because suspicion without evidence becomes superstition. I began to test alternatives. I checked the thermostat and vents. Expanding ducts can pop like footsteps. I killed the ceiling. Fan. Wobble can mimic thuds. I watched the living room light fixture. Vibrations leave a tremor in glass. Nothing moved. Meanwhile, the roof registered another slow press, a shuffle, and the scrape of something like rubber on grit. The idea of a person emerged. Unwelcome but structurally sound, because only a person distributes weight in that rhythm. Yet a person on a wet roof in high wind risks a fall, and risk implies motive. Cats chase shelter. People chase something else. So I advanced to the next decision: escalate or observe. I chose observation first, because opening a door in darkness to verify a threat often creates one. I dimmed the TV, left a hallway light on to frame the interior, and stepped to the middle of the room where I could see both front and back entries. The roof quieted, as if the listener above had become the listener below. For a full minute, nothing happened. In that pause, logic reasserted itself. Branches scrape. Gutters shift under water load. Houses speak in storms. My breathing slowed, and with calmer breath came a final step, lighter this time, pulling back toward the far eve. Eventually, I accepted a provisional conclusion. Either an animal larger than expected tested a path across weak boards, or someone, shielded by rain, scouted a roofline and decided the house was more trouble than it was worth. The difference matters, but the response is the same. Reinforce the boundaries tomorrow. Document tonight. I unmuted the TV, marked the time, and let the storm finish its sentence. Time 0.95s. The storm deepened as the night wore on, and with it came a sound that refused to be absorbed into the background noise of rain and wind. The footsteps, which I had at first dismissed as nothing more than animals or the groan of old timber, began to move with intention. Each step was slow, deliberate, and heavy, echoing across the thin ceiling as if the boards were straining beneath the weight. Then, just as I steadied myself, the sound ceased, right above the living room where I sat. The stillness that followed was not reassuring. Rather, it magnified the tension, for silence after motion suggests awareness. A pause to list. Time, 0.65. A moment of calculation. And through the constant rainfall, I heard a new detail. The faint dragging of something heavy across the roof. A noise too grounded, too weighty to belong to an animal. Faced with this, my first instinct was to retreat into reason. But reason offered no easy explanation. A branch swept by the wind could drag. Yes. But why would it stop directly above the living room and then resume? Gutters overflow. Shingles loosen. Structures complain under stress. Yet this sound carried the clear cadence of will. My mind drew a line. Natural forces move chaotically. But the roof above me pulsed with pattern. Step. Stop. Drag. Wait. Such a sequence points not to accident, but to agents. And agency implies someone was there. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, I reached for the remote and turned the television off. Darkness filled the room at once, save for the occasional flash of lightning that sketched the furniture into brief silhouettes. I sat completely still, breathing shallowly, and that was when the faint tapping began. It was not the rattle of rain or the random percussion of wind, but soft, intentional knocks, spread out in irregular intervals as if to test my reaction. Each tap felt like a probe, a reminder that whatever was above me was aware of my presence below. The air in the room seemed thicker, each second stretching long. Time swirls. And I realized I needed some form of evidence to validate what I was hearing. I took out my phone, started recording, and pointed it toward the ceiling, holding my breath as another tap landed. Later, when I replayed the recording, there were no footsteps, no dragging, no knocks, only a strange, distorted hiss that made the silence worse. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had passed, and so had the sounds. Logic told me that daylight would expose the simple truth. With hesitant steps, I climbed a ladder to the roof, expecting perhaps to see branches, leaves, or nothing at all. Time, 0.95. Yet what I found unsettled me more than I expected. Near the center of the roof, above the living room where I had heard the pause, a section of the wooden paneling was splintered, broken inward as though pressed by a heavy boot. No claw marks, no branches, only the undeniable fracture of wood under human way. In that moment, I was left with two possible conclusions. Either my senses, sharpened by fear and storm, had stitched together a series of natural accidents into a coherent story of footsteps, or someone truly had been there, testing the roof, perhaps testing the house itself. One explanation comforted the min, time 0.655. The other unsettled the soul. But as I stepped down from the ladder, I knew the broken wood would always argue against the easier choice. Story 2. The Man Under the Tree. It was a Saturday night, quiet enough that the ticking of the clock in the hallway sounded louder than usual. I was 15, sitting at my desk with my head bent over homeward, time 0.65. Trying to convince myself that algebra would keep me distracted while my parents were away. Behind the house stood a massive oak tree, older than the neighborhood itself, with roots that pushed up from the soil like veins and branches that stretched into the sky like crooked arms. I had always thought of that tree as harmless, a landmark of the backyard. But that night it became the source of something far more unsettling. At first, the sound came faintly, barely distinct over the scratch of my pencil. 2 short whistles, then silence. I paused, confused, but soon went back to my work, dismissing it as the wind passing through the branches. But less than a minute later, the whistle came again, this time sharper, carrying the clear intention of human breath. Whistling repeats. Wind does not. That was the first moment when unease replaced rational comfort. Trying to explain it, I told myself that maybe it was a neighbor or some kids playing late. Whistling is, after all, a common gesture, a way of signaling to friends or even just passing the time. But here lay the contradiction. My house sat at the edge of the block. The yards were separated by fences, and no one in their right mind would be standing in my backyard, beneath that oak, at 10 o'clock at night. The fact that the sound originated from that specific area was too precise, too deliberate. I moved from my desk to the window and carefully parted the blinds. The porch light cast a dim glow across the yard, but the shadow of the oak swallowed most of the space into darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the silhouette of branches swaying slightly in the night, times 0.95s. But then, as if on cue, the whistle came again, echoing upward, clearer now, as though it had been directed at me. My pulse quickened. Whistling serves 2 functions: to call attention or to taunt. Either way, it was not random anymore. Stepping back from the window, time 12.65 as. I began to consider possibilities. Could it be a friend pulling a prank? Unlikely, since no one knew I was home alone that night. Could it be a wanderer or a drunk, mistaking the backyard for an open space? Possible. But then why stand under the tree and whistle repeatedly? Logic insisted that people do not linger in strangers' yards without reason. Fear suggested that reason was not harmless. The whistles continued for several minutes, each one separated by a long, watchful silence. It felt less like communication and more like a test, a way to measure how long I would take to react. My instinct screamed at me to turn off the lights, to retreat, to pretend the house was empty. Yet curiosity and fear collided, keeping me frozen in place, straining my ears for what might come next. In the end, the whistles stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving only the heavy quiet of the night. But the damage was done now. That oak tree, once a neutral presence in the yard, now carried the memory of intent, the possibility that someone had stood beneath it, watching, whistling, waiting for me to respond. The whistle faded, but silence did not bring comfort. Instead, it made me aware of every creak in the howl, time 12.65, every rustle of branches outside. I stood by the window, hesitating, and when I finally pulled the blinds aside once more, I felt my chest tighten. There, at the base of the old oak tree, stood a man. He was leaning casually against the trunk, but his posture carried no ease, only intent. His head was tilted slightly upward, and even from a distance, even through the shadows, I knew his eyes were fixed on me. In that instant, the boundary between imagination and reality dissolved. This was no trick of the wind, no figment of a restless mind. It was a presence At first, odd trust. Time, white 6-5s. I forced myself to believe in coincidence. Perhaps he was just passing through. A stranger cutting across yards, stopping for a moment beneath the tree. Yet the longer I watched, the less plausible that explanation became. His stance was too deliberate, his stillness too calculated. People who wander usually move. He did not. He stayed rooted to the spot, as though my gaze had tethered him there. The whistle had been a lure, and now the silence was his answer. Time passed strangely in those moments. Seconds stretched, each one heavy with the possibility of motion. I wanted to look away, to shut the blinds, but the fear that he might move closer if I blinked held me captive. And then, almost as though he had read my thoughts, he did move. Slowly, measuredly, he pushed off from the tree and began walking toward the house. His footsteps made no sound that I could hear, but the intent was visible in every step. Each pace shortened the distance between us, and with it, the fragile safety of glass and walls felt weaker. My hand reached instinctively for my phone on the desk. Logic dictated one course of action: call the police. Report a trespasser. Get help. Yet fear introduced hesitation. What if lifting the phone, what if dialing numbers, drew his attention more sharply? What if the light of the screen exposed me further? My mind argued with itself, torn between reason and panic. As the man drew closer and closer, he stopped only a few feet from the window, close enough that the faint glow from the porch light brushed across his figure. I could not make out his face, but I could see the outline of his shoulders, the glint of water dripping from his jacket. Time 0.6, the undeniable focus of someone staring directly inside. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. The space between us, separated only by a thin sheet of glass. My breath caught in my throat, and in that suspended moment, I thought the situation could only escalate. But then, just as suddenly as he had advanced, he was gone. One blink, one shift of the eye, and the space before the window was empty. The backyard, once haunted by his presence, returned to stillness. No footsteps receded. No sound of retreat echoed through the night. It was as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. The rational mind grasped at explanations. Perhaps he had darted away into the shadow of the house, or perhaps my fear had exaggerated what I saw. But the weight of the scene remained too precise, too tangible, to be dismissed as imagination. Minutes later, headlights swept across the driveway, and my parents returned. Relief mixed with dread as I rushed to explain, stumbling through the details: the whistles, the figure by the oak, the advance toward the window, and his abrupt disappearance. At first, they listened with that parental blend of skepticism and concern. But when my father took a flashlight into the yard, the evidence silenced doubt. Around the base of the tree and circling the perimeter of the house were clear impressions of wet shoes pressed deep into the soil. The tracks told the story plainly. Someone had been there, circling, watching, waiting. The sight of those footprints drew a line between what could be imagined and what had truly occurred. My parents exchanged a look heavy with unspoken words, and though they tried to reassure me, I could sense their unease. For me, the conclusion was inescapable. Whistling had not been the wind. The figure had not been a trick of shadow, and the footprints proved a presence with intent. What remained unanswered was motive. Was he testing the house, time 6 miles, searching for weakness, Or simply enjoying the fear he created? That night ended with doors double locked, windows checked twice, and lights left on in rooms that usually slept in darkness. Yet even with precautions, the memory lingered. The image of a man leaning against the oak, staring straight into the window of a boy alone. The logic is clear. A threat that reveals itself may also vanish. But the impression it leaves never truly disappears. Story 3. Strange call at midnight. The house was unusually quiet for a Saturday night. My parents had gone out to a dinner party, leaving me and my younger brother to ourselves. We were used to evenings like this, playing video games, watching TV, or simply sitting in our rooms with the comforting knowledge that, sooner or later, our parents would walk back through the front door. Yet on this night, something unsettled the routine. At exactly midnight, the landline phone rang. It startled us both, for the phone rarely rang after dark, and certainly not that late. I answered cautiously, expecting perhaps a relative or one of my parents calling to check in. But what I heard instead was silence, punctuated only by heavy, labored breathing. It was not the background noise of a poor connection. It was intentional, human, and disturbingly close. At first, I thought it might be a prank. Kids at Tom's school sometimes joked about making late-night calls, trying to scare whoever picked up. That explanation gave me a thin shield of comfort. But it did not last long. The breathing continued, rhythmic and steady, as though the caller wanted me to know I was being listened to. I hung up quickly, convincing myself that it was just a stupid joke. But minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, my brother urged me not to answer. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I picked it up once more. Again, the same sound, breathing, heavier now, with an edge of strain. No words, no wow-so explanation, just the invasive presence of someone on the other end. The logic became harder to dismiss. Wrong numbers do not call twice, and strangers do not sit silently on the line at midnight. Each ring afterward heightened the tension. Every 15 minutes, the phone came alive, and each time, the sound was the same. My brother grew visibly shaken, retreating to the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin. I tried to remain calm, but inside, a storm of possibilities turned over in my mind. Was it someone testing us? A burglar waiting to confirm we were home alone? Or worse, someone enjoying the act of instilling fear? The absence of words was, in fact, its own message. Silence framed by breath is not emptiness. It is intent. By the fourth call, my patience broke. I asked directly, "Who is this? What do you want?" No answer came, only a sharp inhale, followed by the faintest exhale. And then the line went dead. The deliberate nature of it all shook me more than any threat could have. At least a threat defines itself. Breathing leaves everything to the imagination. The most troubling thought, however, came when I considered the logistics. The caller knew our number, chose the exact moment of midnight, and refused to speak. These details suggest not randomness, but targeting. Someone wanted to make their presence felt without ever being seen. The phone became less a tool of communication and more a weapon of intrusion, cutting into the sanctuary of our home. I tried to reassure my brother, telling him that the doors were locked, the lights were on, and that our parents would be home soon. Yet deep down, I could not escape the awareness that whoever was on the line knew exactly where to reach us. And that knowledge alone made the walls feel thinner. The night stretched on, heavy with unanswered questions. Each ring of the phone reminding us that being home alone was not the same as being safe. The first call could still be explained away as a mistake, perhaps even a prank. But when I tried to call the number back, the operator's message cut through any comfort I had left. The number did not exist. That detail, simple yet undeniable, changed everything. Wrong numbers can happen, but non-existent ones do not call in the middle of the night. My brother looked at me with wide eyes, and though I wanted to reassure him, the logic was clear. Someone was trying to reach us from nowhere, and they wanted us to know time 0.95. 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. The sound made us both jump, even though we had been expecting it. Against my better judgment, I picked up. This time, there was no heavy breathing at first, only silence stretching uncomfortably. Then, faint and deliberate, came the whisper, "I see you." The words were soft, almost playful, but their meaning pierced like a blade. Someone was watching us, or at least wanted us to believe so. I slammed the receiver down, heart racing, yet almost immediately regretted it, because if the voice belonged to someone outside, hanging up did nothing to sever the threat. The pattern continued like clockwork. Every 15 minutes, the phone would ring, and each time, the whisper repeated the same chilling phrase, "I see you." My brother begged me not to answer anymore, but ignoring the call felt just as dangerous as picking at you. Time 0.95. The phone, which usually connected us to friends, family, and safety, had become a weapon of intimidation. And what was worse, the rhythm of the calls suggested calculation. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. A prankster grows bored and moves on. This caller was patient, time 0.65, methodical, and persistent. By the fourth or fifth call, my fear had evolved into a dreadful kind of analysis. If the voice said, "I see you," then where was he? Was he parked on the street? Hidden in the yard? Peering through a window we hadn't checked? Each possibility carried its own weight, but all of them shared one conclusion: we were being observed. My brother sat frozen beside me, clutching the blanket as if it offered real protection. I wanted to call the police, but another thought held me back. What if the intruder was inside already, listening, speaking too loudly, turning on the lights? Even picking up the phone to dial could feel like signals, invitations. Then came the final call. The ring echoed through the house, louder than it ever had, as if the sound itself had teeth. I answered, hand trembling, and for a moment I heard only static. Then, in a voice that was still soft but sharper than before, came the words, "Check your door." The line went dead. My breath caught, and I turned slowly toward the front hallway. The door, which I remembered locking before my parents left, now stood slightly ajar. The lock was twisted, the frame marked. Cold air seeped in through the narrow opening. For several seconds, I could not move. The logical chain was impossible to deny now. The calls were not idle threats, not games played from afar. Whoever had been watching was not just outside, but close enough to touch the lock, to force the door. My brother whimpered, and that broke my paralysis. I pulled him by the arm, rushing us upstairs into my room. We locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and pressed our backs against the wall, waiting. The minutes stretched like hours. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sounded like footsteps. We didn't speak, afraid even whispers would betray our location. I clutched my phone but couldn't bring myself to dial. Fear of making noise outweighed reason. Instead, we stayed in silence, listening, as though the absence of sound might protect us. At last, headlights washed across the windows. My parents had returned. We bolted from the room, yelling over each other as we explained what happened. My father checked the front door, and what he found confirmed everything. The frame was splintered where someone had forced time pause joint 6, and on the wooden floor just inside were wet footprints that did not belong to us. The conclusion was inescapable. This had not been a prank or coincidence. Someone had targeted our home, tested our fear, and nearly entered. The phone was not just harassment. It was preparation, a way to ensure we were awake, alert, and vulnerable. In the end, we had survived the night, but survival brought no comfort. The sight of that broken lock and those footprints meant the threat had been real all along. And the voice, whispering, "I see you," would never leave my memory, because logic dictated one terrifying truth. At some solemn point during that night, he truly did. Story 4. Light in the forest. I was 19 at the time, still living in a small house near the edge of a narrow forest. The woods were nothing extraordinary, just a thin strip of trees dividing the neighborhood from farmland. But for me, they held a certain calm. I often went walking there at night, letting the quiet swallow up the day's noise. That routine gave me comfort, a sense of control over solitude. Yet one night, during a sudden blackout, the forest replaced calm with unease. The power had cut out across the neighborhood, leaving the street in total darkness. I stood by my bedroom window, trying to adjust my eyes to the absence of light, when I noticed something unusual. Deep within the trees, a small beam flickered, an unmistakable flashlight, blinking on and off in short bursts. At first, I leaned on reason. Perhaps it was a neighbor walking a dog, or kids exploring. But almost instantly, the logic unraveled. Who wanders into a forest during a blackout, late at night, and signals repeatedly with a light? Random movement makes sense. Calculated flashes do not. I remained at the window, studying the rhythm. The beam would vanish, then return, each time pointing toward my house as if it were trying to be noticed. This detail mattered. Light is communication. People wave flashlights when lost, or when they want attention. If someone was in trouble, why not shout? Why not approach the road instead of hiding behind trees? The absence of sound was the loudest part of the message. Doubt crept in, and my mind sought alternatives. Could it be a hunter? Could it be construction workers fixing lines in the blackout? But no vehicles had arrived. No voices carried across the night. No sound of equipment accompanied the glow. Just the silent, deliberate pattern of light repeating itself. The longer I stared, the more the unease sharpened into suspicion. Flashing a light in darkness is not just a signal, it is also bait. The Forez, time, 0.65s. Normally a place of freedom, now resembled a stage. and I could not tell whether I was meant to be the audience or the target. What unsettled me most was not the light itself, but the intent behind it. Someone was out there, using the cover of blackout and trees, making sure I knew they were present. From that moment on, I could no longer view the woods as neutral ground. The flashlight turned them into a question I could not answer, one that logic suggested was better left alone. The flickering light did not stop. It danced in and out of the trees as though someone were testing whether I was still watching. At first, it seemed random. But then the flashes grew steadier, slower, and finally halted at the very edge of the forest, where the line of trees met my backyard. My stomach tightened. Darkness has a way of exaggerating distance, but there was no mistaking the position now. The light was pointed directly toward my house. And then, through the quiet of the blackout, time 6:05, came a voice, soft, low, and almost hesitant. It carried across the open space. "Come here." Hearing those words fractured any comfort I had left. If someone truly needed help, logic dictated they would call louder, repeat themselves, or even step into the open. But this voice was measured, deliberate, just strong enough to reach me while still cloaked by the trees. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. I froze at the window. My mind split between two impulses: to believe that a stranger might be in distress, or to accept the more chilling possibility that someone was luring me out. The silence that followed only deepened the dread. I decided I needed clarity, not just instinct. Grabbing an old pair of binoculars from my desk, I focused on the spot where the flashlight had stopped. At first, I saw only one beam, narrow and steady. But as my eyes adjusted through the lenses, the scene widened into something far worse. There were not one but three distinct beams, each held at the height of a person, aligned in a row just inside the tree line. They were motionless, unwavering, as if waiting for a signal. My hands trembled as I lowered the binoculars, and the realization settled heavily. This was not coincidence. Time 0.65 as. Not an accident of kids wandering. This was organized. Fear now pressed into logic. One person with a flashlight can be explained away, lost, drunk, or careless. But three, standing silently together, signaling with precision, is intent. The question shifted from, why are they here, to what are they planning? My instincts screamed that opening the door, stepping outside, or even leaving the window uncovered could be catastrophic. Whoever they were, they wanted movement. They wanted a response. With deliberate calm, I stepped back from the glass and drew the curtains shut. Then, moving quickly, I locked every door and window, double-checking each latch as though it were the final barrier against intrusion. My heart raced, but my actions had to remain steady. Finally, I picked up the phone and called the police, explaining in as much detail as possible what I had seen and heard. The wait for their arrival felt endless, each second stretching longer than the last. I half expected the pounding of fists on the door or the shatter of glass at any moment. But the house remained silent except for the rain and the occasional groan of the wind. When the patrol car finally pulled into the driveway, I nearly collapsed with relief. Yet the outcome brought no closure. The officers searched the tree line, their flashlights cutting through the dark, but found no one. Not a single person, not a single light. What they did find, however, was undeniable. Deep impressions of tire tracks in the damp soil near the road, the kind left by a small truck or van. The prints were fresh, made only minutes before. The evidence confirmed what fear had already concluded. Someone, or more likely several people, had been there, waiting, watching, and signaling. Their plan remained unknown, but their retreat left one truth clear. It had been real. And as the officers assured me they would keep watch over the area, I knew that the forest outside my window would never again be just a quiet place to walk at night. It had become a reminder that not every call in the darkness is meant to be answered. Story 5. The Woman in the Mirror. I was 22 when I moved into a small apartment just outside the campus district. The place was modest, nothing more than a bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom tucked at the end of the hall. What struck me most about the bathroom was the mirror, a wide slab of glass fixed directly across from the doorway. Every time I entered, my own reflection seemed to confront me before I even stepped inside. At first, it was just another feature of the apartment, but over time, it became something else entirely. Each night, usually close to midnight, I followed the same routine: brush my teeth, wash my face, prepare for sleep. Yet with each repetition came the same unsettling feeling that someone was standing just behind me. Logic tried to soothe time Turne 95s. I told myself it was only the angle of the mirror, the way shadows from the hallway stretched across the tile floor. The human mind, especially when tired, fills blank spaces with threats. Still, the sensation was persistent, like a presence that refused to be dismissed. There is a difference between imagination and instinct. Imagination invent. I'm on point sevens. Miles. Instinct warns. The longer I stared into that glass, the less I trusted imagination. My reflection looked normal, but the air in the room carried a pressure, as if space was being shared. Some nights I would brush faster, unwilling to keep my eyes fixed on the mirror for too long. Other nights I would pause mid-motion, glancing over my shoulder only to confirm nothing was there. Yet the moment I looked forward again, the feeling returned, stronger, sharper, undeniable. I began to analyze it. Why the bathroom? Why the mirror? Was it the confinement of the space, or the knowledge that the only exit stood directly behind me, always within reach of whatever I imagined there? The logical explanation circled back to psychology. Mirrors unsettle because they double the world, offering a reflection that may not always behave as expected. If shadows linger too long, if the mind is tired, even ordinary reflections feel foreign. But logic alone failed to bring peace. Each night the pattern repeated, and each night the suspicion deepened. Standing in front of that mirror became less about hygiene and more about endurance, a quiet test of how long I could convince myself nothing stood at my back. And though I always left the bathroom unscathed, the question remained like a splinter. If nothing was ever there, why did it feel so certain that something was? One night, the tension that had been building around that bathroom mirror finally revealed itself. I was standing in front of the sink, toothbrush in hand, when something shifted in the reflection. At first, I thought it was my own shadow stretching strangely under the dim ceiling light. But then I saw it clearly. The figure of a woman, time 0.95. Her hair was long, spilling over her shoulders like a curtain, and she stood motionless in the doorway behind me. The image was too sharp to be a trick of the eyes. My pulse spiked, and I turned around instantly. But the doorway was empty. Just the hallway leading into darkness. No one there. I forced myself to look back at the mirror, expecting to see nothing. Yet my own reflection stared back at me as if nothing had ever happened. In that moment, logic tried to wrestle with fear. Maybe exhaustion had blurred perception. Maybe the flicker of the hallway light cast a shape that my mind misinterpreted. But there was a flaw in that reasoning. Shadows do not hold detail. What I had seen was not vague. It was specific, with features and posture too human to be dismissed as imagination. Still, I convinced myself to finish brushing, though every second felt like standing on the edge of something unseen. Then came the moment that broke the balance entirely. Without warning, the mirror began to fog over, as though warm breath had condensed across the glass. I had not run hot water, nor had the air changed temperature. Yet the haze thickened, swallowing my reflection until it blurred. And then, pressed against the surface from within, appeared the imprint of a hand. 5 fingers, spread wide, etched into the condensation. My own hand was at my side, trembling, so there was no mistaking whose it was. The pressure of the print seemed to pulse outward, as if something on the other side of the glass wanted to push through. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the MA time, or 0.65s. 1. Staring in disbelief. Rational thought fractured. A mirror reflects. It does not create. A handprint from the inside implied an impossibility. Yet there it was, clear and deliberate. I fled the room, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding so violently that I could hear blood rushing in my ears. The rest of that night, I sat awake in the living room, lights blazing, refusing to step back into the bathroom. By morning, the decision was made. No explanation could outweigh the evidence of what I had seen. I packed my essentials into a single bag, left the rest of my belongings where they were, and walked out without looking back. Later, when I returned briefly to collect the lease paperwork, the landlord made an offhand remark that solidified my fear. He told me the mirror had been moved from another property years ago, a house where a violent crime had taken place, a murder that left the walls permanently stained. He laughed as though it were time G.65s. But for me, it was confirmation. The mirror had never been just a piece of glass. It was a witness, a remnant of a place marked by violence, and perhaps a vessel that carried traces of what had occurred there. That night proved one truth I could no longer deny. Some objects are not haunted because of where they are, but because of where they have been.